In today's video, Magnus Carlsen disrespects Vladimir Kramnik on move 1 with the move 1e3 in the recent Title Tuesday matchup on chess.com. And after this game, I wouldn't be shocked if Vladimir accuses Magnus of cheating as well. Now, after Magnus Carlsen's brilliant move 1e3, here Vladimir Kramnik responds knight to f6, trying to develop his kingside. But now Magnus Carlsen, he continues with this very strange idea. He goes b3, expanding on the queenside, intending bishop b2 with the fianchetto of the dark squared bishop on this long diagonal. Now, Vladimir, how does he respond? In the game, he goes g6, intending bishop g7 with the fianchetto of his own dark squared bishop. But of course, Magnus Carlsen, he is not amused. He goes bishop b2, continuing his plan. Now, bishop g7 on the board, knight f3, short castles, and then finally d4, expanding in the center for Magnus Carlsen. And this is a favorite setup of Hikaru Nakamura. The idea being you stay very flexible with your pieces. Perhaps you want to go bishop e2, knight d2, short castles, and then play it from there. Now here in this position, what is Vladimir Kramnik going to do to challenge White's pawn center? In the game, he goes c5, expanding on the queen side. However, this is a very double-edged idea. Here, Magnus can just take on c5, and that is what he does in the game. D takes c5, and now the onus is on Vladimir Kramnik to try and regain that pawn on the queen side. And if he doesn't, he's going to be in a world of trouble. Now, in this position, it's very important for Vladimir to find the best idea. In the game, he goes queen to a5, but this turns out to be a very big mistake. Instead, you have to go queen to c7, challenging the pawn on c5 with the queen on the c7 square. The idea being you want to free up that a5 square for the pawn to advance a7 to a5, trying to break up the queen side in response to a future b4 idea. Let's see how this plays out. Instead of queen c7, here Vladimir, of course, goes queen to a5, but now Magnus, c3 on the board, threatening b4, and here's the big problem. If Vladimir goes queen takes c5, then Magnus is going to respond bishop to a3, skewering the queen on c5 and the pawn on e7 behind it. So for example, queen takes bishop a3, then the queen has to move, then bishop takes e7, wins the pawn, and Magnus will have a clear advantage in the game. So of course, queen takes c5 is not the right idea. Instead, Vladimir just retreats his queen back to c7. Queen c7 on the board, but now why in the world did Vladimir go queen to a5 and then queen to c7 in this game? To be honest, it looks like Magnus Carlsen's very shocking opening 1e3 has paid off, as Vladimir does not know what to do in this position. Alright, from here, bishop e2 and then a5, expanding on the queen side. Again, queen takes c5 would be met by bishop a3, so that is not a possibility yet. But with that in mind, is Vladimir even going to win back that pawn on the queen side? It's looking like the answer might be no, because here Magnus expands on the queen side with the move b4, a very good move, simply bolstering that pawn on c5. Now Vladimir, knight to c6, putting pressure on b4, but Magnus is ready. He goes a3, defending the pawn on b4, and of course, if Vladimir takes on b4, a takes, that rook on the a1 square will be defended by the bishop, so Magnus does not have any tactical problems here. Now in the game, Vladimir, what should he be doing from here? Well, again, it is very difficult to regain that pawn, and with that in mind, you do have to think about various pawn sacrifices here. Now, the computer likes the idea of rook d8, intending d6 or d5, trying to span in the center. However, here, Vladimir, he goes b6, a completely different idea, but this move turns out to be very, very weak. Here, Magnus just takes on b6, c takes b6, and Vladimir takes back with the queen, queen takes, and now Vladimir is officially one pawn down on the queen side, and he has no real plan to regain the pawn, meaning he's going to have to fight for compensation in this position, but I'm not sure where it's coming from. Here, Magnus, he just castles, short castles on the board. Of course, there were some stronger ideas like b5 immediately, trying to gain space on the queen side and knock back the knight, but instead, short castles is the move. And now Vladimir punishes Magnus Carlsen's mistake of not going b5. He goes bishop to a6 immediately, trying to trade off those light squared bishops and also trying to control that b5 square a little bit better. So now b5 is not a possibility, as the bishop would take the pawn on b5. Now from here, Magnus, he can either take on a6 right away or go knight d2. Either move is perfectly fine. In the game, bishop takes a6 on the board, queen takes, and then knight d2 for Magnus. Now here, Vladimir, again, he is down a pawn. How is he going to fight for compensation? Well, he starts by bringing in the knight to the d5 square. Knight d5, the idea being he wants to open up the line of attack of the bishop on c3 as well as the knight. However, the big problem with this move is that knight on d5 is very vulnerable. Magnus will be able to drive it back with, say, c4 or e4 at some point, at which point that knight will be more of a liability than an asset on d5. So now Magnus here, queen c2 on the board, the best way to defend the pawn on c3, so an excellent move by Magnus. And now here Vladimir, what is he going to do to increase the pressure on the queen side? His main asset is those open B and C files, or the semi-open files. So maybe he wants to get his rooks over to the B and C files to increase the pressure. For example, rook f to c8 or rook f to b8 are both very, very good moves here. Instead, he goes knight to b6. The idea being he wants to get his knight away from the center where it could be hit by a c4 or e4 advance. However, knight to b6 is not a good move as it does block the open B file. Instead, the computer actually likes the idea of knight to f6, and that just shows how questionable a move knight d5 was for Vladimir Kramnik on the move prior. Now here Magnus, he punishes this idea of knight b6 and expands on the queen side with the move c4. Of course, now all of his pawns are being supported sufficiently. If black tries to take on b4 and then take with a knight, that would leave the queen hanging on a6, so that is not a possibility yet. So here, bishop takes b2 on the board for Vladimir, trading off those dark squared bishops. However, again, this is not good for Vladimir, as now his dark squares on the king side are going to be a lot weaker. So, bishop takes, and then here in this position, instead of taking the bishop right away, queen takes b2. Here Magnus plays the much stronger intermediate idea, b5, expanding on the queen side, keeping the a file closed, and now he has that attack on the queen on a6. So Vladimir, what the heck should he be doing here? Well, the best idea is you have to retreat the queen. For example, queen to a7 may be the best idea, but instead, Vladimir Kramnik, he's in the mood to sacrifice his queen, and he does it with the move bishop takes a1. Now, of course, Magnus has the option of taking the queen, and typically when your opponent hangs the queen, taking the queen is the best move, and that is what Magnus does here. So, b takes a5 on the board. Now, bishop g7 gets the bishop out of the attack of the rook, and now, for the most part, the dust has settled. Magnus Carlsen, he just won the queen, and what does Vladimir Kramnik have in return? He has the rook and the bishop, and that is about it. Of course, that pawn on the a6 square is going to fall sooner or later, so Vladimir will have that one extra pawn. But again, Magnus Carlsen is going to be up material here, and Vladimir Kramnik is in a lot of trouble. All right, Magnus, he starts by increasing the pressure with the move c5, knocking back that very weak knight on b6. Now, knight d5 on the board, and queen d3, once again harassing the knight on d5, and once again that knight will have to move, or Vladimir will have to find a way to defend it. So, in the game, e6 on the board, supporting the knight on d5 with the pawn. However, here, Magnus, he has various ways to increase the pressure, and he starts with a very strong idea, rook to b1, activating the rook on the open b file, threatening rook b5, rook b6 ideas in the future, and of course that pawn on a6 is currently defended by the queen on d3, therefore rook takes a6 is not a possibility yet. Alright, Vladimir, he is a former world champion, you can't count this guy out yet, even though he's accusing everyone, including Daniel Narditsky, of cheating lately. So what does he do here? Knight b8 on the board, hits that pawn on the a6 square with the rook and the knight, threatening either rook takes or knight takes a6. But Magnus, he jumps in with the rook to b5, pressuring the very weak a5 point. Now if Vladimir goes knight takes a6, rook takes b5 will be a possibility, and he wins a pawn and puts pressure on the new knight on b6. So Vladimir, what is his response? Well, in the game, he goes knight to c3, a very interesting idea. Of course, that knight is being supported by the bishop on g7. Therefore, queen takes c3 is not an option yet. And beyond that, that knight is threatening that rook on the b5 square. So now the rook does have to move. So, in the game, rook b6 for Magnus, taking advantage of the fact that the knight is no longer on d5. And that means the knight no longer controls that very important b6 square. And now that pawn on b6 is being defended by the rook and the queen on d3. And that means rook takes or knight takes a6 is not a possibility. I can't draw arrows. All right, from here, knight to a4 on the board, pressures that rook on b6. The rook is going to have to move. Rook to b5 on the board, and now rook takes a5 is a threat once again. Now from here, knight takes a6, and you may have expected in this position Magnus Carlsen to play the move rook takes a5. That looks very logical, winning a free pawn, hitting the knight on the a4 square. However, here, Magnus finds a completely different idea. He just goes knight to b3, bringing in the knight to the queen side. Perhaps he wants to go knight takes a5 instead of rook takes. And of course, beyond that, on b3, the knight does defend that c5 pawn, that being the other idea of that knight c3 to a4 maneuver from black. those knights are putting pressure on c5, so Magnus just defends. Now from here, Vladimir, his best idea is going to be increasing the pressure on that weak pawn on c5. Rook f to c8 is the move, lighting up the rook with the pawn. But instead here, Vladimir, he plays knight to c7, and this move turns out to be very, very weak and very passive. And here Magnus, of course, his rook is being under attack. However, he just slides that rook up to the b7 square, rook to b7 on the board, and now the knight's under pressure, the d7 pawn is under pressure, and in the future, even the f7 pawn may be under pressure if Magnus opens up that 7th rank and then goes knight to g5. So Vladimir here, under all sorts of different threats, both now and in the future. All right, here Vladimir, knight d5 on the board, getting the knight out of the attack. But here Magnus, he finds a brilliant idea. He does not take on d7 right away. That pawn is so weak, it is going to fall sooner or later. So with that in mind, here Magnus, he finds a way to remove that knight from the d5 square. He starts with the move g3. Now this move is very, very important. If you go e4 right away, right here, e4, then knight to f4 is a very good move, as that e-pawn no longer controls the f4 square. So instead, g3 on the board, the idea being you want to control that f4 square, which makes e4 an even bigger threat, as then knight to f4 will not be a possibility. And of course, beyond these ideas, this move g3 does open up the g2 square for the king, meaning in the future there will be no back rank mating threats. For example, rook b1 will never be checkmate. So now here, Vladimir, rook f to c8 on the board, the right idea, but a move too late. Vladimir is just a little bit too slow against Magnus in this game, and now Magnus pushes that e-pawn, e4, again showing the idea of g3, knocking out that knight to f4 idea from Vladimir, and now the knight has to go somewhere else. So, knight to f6 on the board, but now e5 once again drives back that knight. Where is he going to go? Knight d5 on the board, and here Magnus, after Vladimir's crazy queen sacrifice, he is really starting to increase the pressure, and he does that with the move rook takes d7, winning the pawn and lining up threats on the f7 pawn. For example, knight g5 could be coming next. If the knight and even the queen line up with that pawn, that would be an absolute disaster for poor Vladimir. All right, from here, knight takes c5 on the board, winning the free pawn, but Magnus, he does not mind. He trades the knights, knight takes c5, and then rook takes c5 for Vladimir. And here again, the main idea is just piling up the pressure on that very weak f7 pawn. And here Magnus just jumps in with the knight, knight to g5 on the board, threatening either rook takes or knight takes f7. Now here Black, he goes rook to f8. Vladimir is doing his best to defend, but Magnus Carlsen, he just increases the pressure with the move queen to f3, a very strong idea. Now real fast, there was an even stronger move in this position, that being the idea of queen to a6, jumping in with the queen on the queen side, putting pressure on that pawn on a5, and threatening ideas like queen to a7 or queen to b7, piling up the pressure on the 7th rank. That would have been the strongest idea, and there is a very specific reason why. Here, after queen to f3, Vladimir is going to have various ways to try and drive back that knight from the g5 square. So, for example, here, Vladimir, he jumps in with the rook to c3, a very, very strong idea. First of all, you are putting pressure on that queen. That temporarily stops all ideas like knight takes f7 or rook takes, and beyond that, you're also pressuring the very weak pawn on the a3 square. And if Vladimir can win that pawn, he will have a passed pawn on a5, and that pawn could threaten to just push down the board, and that would be very, very dangerous. So now here, Magnus, there is no way to keep the queen on the f-file. All of these squares are covered by the black pieces. So queen to e4 on the board, and here, Vladimir Kramnik, he has an opportunity to play an absolutely brilliant idea. That would be bishop to h6, and that move drives back the knight from g5. It has to go back to f3, and then all of the threats on f7 are gone, and then you can just clean up that pawn on a3, and that, again, that passed pawn on a5 will give you winning chances in this weird middle game endgame following Vladimir Kramnik's crazy queen sacrifice we saw earlier in the game. However, he doesn't find the idea of bishop to h6. Instead here, rook takes a3 on the board. This move makes a lot of sense, winning the free pawn, but now Magnus will have various ways to increase the pressure, and in the game, he doesn't find the strongest continuation, queen to g4. Instead, king g2 on the board for Magnus, and again, Vladimir has the opportunity to go bishop to h6, driving back that knight on g5, and basically equalizing the game, and once again, he misses the idea. So, rook b3 on the board, now Magnus rook to a7, and this is Vladimir's last chance to go bishop to h6, And again, it's his last chance to miss the idea. Instead, rook b5 on the board, a very passive move. Now Magnus Carlsen has that rook behind the pass pawn. Vladimir's rook is very passive. And here Magnus, he finds a way to try and put Vladimir out of his misery in this game. He goes queen to f3, piling up the pressure on that very weak pawn on the f7 point. Here Vladimir goes h6, putting the question to the knight, are you going to take on f7 or are you going to wimp out? Well, here Magnus, he does not wimp out. He takes on f7 with the knight. Knight takes f7, self-pinning the knight to the queen. Magnus is going to have to worry about various ideas like that. However, he is in complete control here. And here in this position, Vladimir makes one of the last mistakes of the game. Knight to b4, jumping away with the knight from the center. However, it's not really clear what this accomplishes. And here Magnus, queen to g4, a very strong idea, targeting both the weak pawns on g6 and e6. Now, real fast, you may be wondering, after queen to g4, isn't that knight on f7 of Magnus just hanging? Can't Vladimir just take the knight for free? Well, the answer is yes, but it runs into a very, very nasty pin by the queen on the rook to the king. So, rook takes f7 on the board, and then Magnus Carlsen, the move is queen takes e6, pinning the rook to the king. The threat is queen takes f7. There is simply no way to defend against that threat. And for that reason, in this position, Vladimir Kramnik resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. The threat is just queen takes f7, then queen takes g7, and that will be checkmate. So wow, what a game by Magnus Carlsen and Vladimir Kramnik in this game with this crazy queen sacrifice. And let's just hope Vladimir Kramnik does not accuse Magnus of cheating in this game the way he just accused Daniel Naroditsky of cheating in apparently some online blitz games. But wow, what a game. All right, Chess YouTube, if you enjoyed this video, please smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much for doing that. And check out this video right here where Magnus Carlsen disrespects Vladimir Kramnik on move 1 with the birds opening after 1 f4. I'm sure you're going to love that video, so check it out. And I'll see you in the next video.